Hi, Ken and Susan. I appreciate you guys touching base with me here today. What I wanted to review was taking some time to run through some of the education goals we had outlined and some of the potential strategies that we can utilize. So the first thing to make sure that we have on point is that we just wanted to cover, for each of the three kids, we wanted to cover 100% of 4 years worth of college education at a typical state university, which today's dollars we value at about $23,000. So the first thing for us to take into account is to figure out what that's going to cost down the road when the kids are actually in school. So seeing as how we have assumed a 6% rate of inflation for education costs, this means that the first year for Brentley, in about 8 years when she goes to school, it's going to be about $36,658. For Bailey, when she goes to school in 13 years, we're looking at about $49,057 for the first year. And then for Bethany, year one in about 16 years, we're going to look at about $58,428. So again, this is the first year for each of the three kids in school. Each year after that, obviously the assumed rate is going to be a little bit higher with that 6% inflation. So basically what I'm getting at in this initial point is that we're going to have to save a lot if we're going to reach the goal of covering 100% of the cost of education. So there's a few different ways. Before I get into the actual recommendation, I wanted to outline the different types of accounts that a lot of people use for college specifically. The first of these is a qualified tuition program, also known as a Section 529 plan. This is also typically probably one of the most common forms used, and here it acts in a very similar way to a lot of other qualified accounts, thus the name. So very similar to the way the retirement accounts that you currently save into operate, in that all of the contributions that we put in grow tax deferred, and then they are tax free upon withdrawal as long as they're used for qualified education expenses, tuition, room and board, etc. And so this is a plan that also allows us to have higher annual contribution limits, and given the aggressive savings that we're going to need to outline in order to get us on track for these goals, this would probably be the best route for us to follow. The other advantage here is that if one of the kids ends up getting any type of scholarship or anything like that where they don't utilize it for education, we can transfer the ownership over to one of the other remaining two kids, which would also be beneficial, again, since the savings goals we outlined are so aggressive. We're going to want to have the ability to potentially utilize some of the other savings for some of the other kids if they don't utilize 100% of it. So the second type of account that's typically used is commonly referred to as a uniform transfer to minors account or a uniform gift to minors account, where also commonly referred to as just a custodial account. Here it acts a little bit differently in that there aren't really any sort of contribution limits, but we do need to be mindful of currently the gift tax limits each year, because the way these accounts operate is that you are listed as the custodian, or essentially the decision maker on the account, but the ownership still lies within each of the kids' Social Security numbers. And so depending on how much we save in there each year, if there's any sort of dividends or capital gains paid out in those years, there's a potential that there may be some taxes owed. And again, given how aggressively we'll need to save for the education goals, there's a decent chance that there could be some tax implications each year. I'll say the one benefit with these types of accounts, though, is the flexibility we have to utilize it for other resources for the kids. Once you gift it to them, it's essentially their ownership. We can't take it back. So if the kids get a scholarship, academic or athletic, then they could always utilize the funds down the road for other types of purchases. One disadvantage I will say that a lot of parents see in these types of accounts, though, are that at the age of majority, the child gains control of the account. That's either 18 or 21. It varies a little bit state to state. But at that point, the child, each of the three kids is going to get essentially full ownership and control of the account to do what they want with. So hopefully they're utilizing it for education, but that's obviously something we'll want to take into account. And then the third type of account that is often utilized is called a Coverdell Education Savings Account. Now, this is very much like the 529 program I outlined earlier, but the major difference is that it can be used for pretty much all education levels, so preschool, middle school, high school, any sort of education expenses prior to college and including college. The major downside to these types of accounts, though, is that the current annual limit is only at $2,000. So given, again, the aggressive savings goals we have, the Coverdell is likely not to be our best option. So in reviewing all three of those, I recommend that the 529 savings program is going to be our best option. Again, because all of the contributions and growth that we put in there are going to be able to be taken out tax-free when used for education expenses. And again, given the amount that we need to set aside and save, there's a good chance that if we had it in the custodial account, that there could be tax implications that we have to be aware of each and every year. So for simplicity, as well as to make sure that we can avoid some of that potential tax burden, the 529 plan is definitely going to be our best option. One thing I do want to recommend, though, is we have very aggressive savings options, but somewhat restrained cash flow to be able to put towards each of the kids' educations. And so currently, based on the numbers outlined in the plan, the first year alone and for the first essentially 8 years until Brentley goes to school, we're going to have to save a total of about $31,000 per year. Now keep in mind, again, that seems like a large number, but when each year of college is going to be over $35,000 and up to $55,000 for each of the 3 kids, the numbers start to make a little bit more sense. So one thing that we're going to want to look at is ultimately what we're able to do with cash flow. Now there are some recommendations outlined later in the plan that highlight some areas that we can potentially cut back on or also increase our income via Uncle Joe's that may allow us some additional capacity to save. But in the meantime, if we were to reduce some of the overall goal right off the bat, we could at least not feel so overwhelmed. And year by year, take our situation into account and see if increased savings down the road might be a possibility. But even if we reduce that goal to about 50%, we'd only have to save roughly $16,000 per year. And if we cut that all the way down to a third, we'd have to save just a little bit over $10,000 per year. So these are still pretty high numbers overall, but I think with these, with this type of savings that we want to get in place, as well as just the cash flow available, I think starting out at this level is going to be a much better way to go about it. And then again, in future years, we'll take a look at potentially increasing that later on. So any questions that you guys have on this so far?